Welcome. This is John Bear Raber again with the history of the world from the point of view of the first persons. This is a study that I actually started on almost 50 years ago when I heard a television program that was called The Red Paint People, or Maritime Archaics. And the story fascinated me so much that I actually took a trip to the Northwest Atlantic shore to Maine to look at what this story covered, which was grave sites of people that had buried their dead, which was rather interesting. This is 7,000 years ago. And within their graves, they had a number of elements that included effigies of narwhal and other fish and birds, and large baskets of iron oxide, which the only thing that people knew would be useful for would be red paint. And so the people that discovered the graves decided that it was probably used for religious purposes. And so my trip to Maine was to take a look at the grave sites, or what they dug out of the grave sites, and having studied, especially since then, ancient tools, I could identify every element within the grave as a tool. The effigies were all weights for netting, and other things in there were clearly tools. So why wouldn't the red paint have been a form of a tool? And so I started exploring what might have been the purpose of that particular tool. To understand that, I need to tell a little bit about the red paint story. It was the Red Paint People, the Maritime Archaics people story. The grave sites were found, as I said, as old as 7,000 years old. And most of them were between 5,000 and 7,000 years old. And what's even more interesting is, although the oldest ones are found on this side of the ocean, the western side of the Atlantic, North Atlantic, there were red paint grave sites found on the northeastern shore of the Atlantic, which was even more interesting. What this leads us to believe is that the people from the Northwest Atlantic, the areas of Maine, Newfoundland, up in the Canadian area, actually discovered Europe somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago. And that's a rather interesting concept. How could that have possibly been? Now, one of the things to realize is these are people that were ancestors to what we now call the Eskimos and the Inuits. They have other terms for them right now, but usually the Eskimos are considered the people that are on the Northwest Atlantic. The Inuits were the Alaskan people. But these were people that lived in a year-round winter society. They had snow almost all the time. They lived off of fish. They had very little vegetable or non-fish or mammal, the seals, the walrus, the whale, meat to eat, and they survived quite well for 12 months a year. My belief is the Maritime Archaics used a boat similar to what the Eskimos and Inuits used, and that's a boat like this. This is called an umiak. It's made out of skin, and the skins probably, for the lower part, were walrus. For the upper part, might have been seal. The inner spars were made from whale bones. And this particular umiak is a model of a six-person umiak. This is a similar model of a kayak, which most of you will recognize, and they, I believe, were by the same people and used by the same people. There are records in our history of umiaks that held between 50 and 70 people. This is a very large boat, and they had masts and sails. Now the question is, how could someone using a boat like this go from Maine to Europe? And there's actually a potential answer to that. If you consider the fact of where Greenland is, and I'll show you on a globe, This is a globe that shows the northern part of the world. The reason I'm using this is rather than a flat map is this actually shows true distances. The flat map, when you get up into the northern and southern hemisphere, are totally wrong. If you'll notice in here, this is Greenland. And Greenland has an eastern side and a western side. The western side comes down past Canada, Hudson Bay, and to the point of Newfoundland, New England. The eastern side comes down by Norway, Iceland, and then on out to the southern point where it is actually closer to the northwestern shores than it is the northeastern shores. Now, what's unique about these areas is both have iceberg flows down both the eastern edge and the western edge. And in the summertime, icebergs coming down on the on the western side would come out into the Atlantic Ocean at a point where it would run into the Gulf Stream coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. And that Gulf Stream would take those icebergs, as we know from the Titanic and others, across the North Atlantic and in fact into the areas of Ireland, Scotland, and Norway. Now at some point they would be broken up enough to where they were no longer icebergs, but that would be a common process. Similar icebergs would come down along the eastern coast of Greenland and come across into the place where the point of Greenland was, which is the original point where the Gulf Stream starts taking the icebergs across. What that means is a people living in Maine or Newfoundland would be able to have scouts out on the water in smaller umiaks or kayaks and watching for an iceberg that was the right size coming down and hitting the Gulf Coast. When they found an appropriate sized iceberg, they could take one or more umiaks out to the iceberg and actually take the umiak out of the ocean, turn it upside down, and use it as a primary house for the people living on the iceberg. They would have with them kayaks, which the kayaks could actually be used in numerous ways. They could be just people out in the kayaks going along with the umiaks, but they could actually rig the kayaks up as outriggers for the umiaks in rough weather, so that in the rough weather, the boat could in fact still manage to survive from weather. Whether or not there were people in the kayak would depend. They could actually have people in the kayak that, as you know, they can actually seal themselves to the kayak, and they could survive literally in the kayak, and they could cover the top of the umiaks to where the water would in fact not be gaining on the inside, and they could have people inside, like the children could be in the bottom of the boat using animal fat to patch any of the seams in the bottom of the boat that were coming open. And so they could actually have this working together. Then once these boats came out and became the basic house on the iceberg, then the kayaks, the 1 and 2 person kayaks, become the fishing boats where the people could take them out into the ocean, and that's where they would see the narwhal. Now that's the important part. An effigy of the narwhal on the north coast of the western Atlantic indicates those people were going out well beyond the point where the Gulf Stream passes the tip of Greenland, because the narwhal are coming down, usually traveling in that eastern portion of it. So these were not animals that they would have seen if they were only fishing off the shores of the New World. Now, why would the people have been doing this? And that's a critical question. Well, let's talk the first one, the ability. The key problem with crossing the North Atlantic would be fresh water, because you're an ocean of salt water. Fresh water is, in fact, an iceberg. They have all the fresh water they want. By burning oil fats, they could melt the iceberg water, the iceberg, as water and create more space for their housing and flatter areas to create an iceberg that could take them comfortably across the North Atlantic. They would have plenty of food because they would have the fish in the ocean, as well as walruses and seals, which are known to come out on icebergs. And so they would have all that and then with the kayaks going along, they could hunt these animals from the the water, including birds, which they could actually throw nets over the birds and scoop them up with the weights that they had on the nets that I saw in the grave. So they could, the ability was definitely there. The opportunity was there because in the summer months, in the beginning of the summer months, they could take the icebergs that were hitting the Gulf Stream and take them across, end up going past Ireland, Scotland, and then ultimately into Norway, and then sail north in their Umiaks to another iceberg coming down off the eastern coast of Greenland, which would have put them right back in New England after that summer trip. So in the next winter, when the weather was so bad on the Atlantic, they would actually be back on the land. Now, this would have been a great opportunity. What's the motive for doing that? The motive would in fact be, we are in fact a sea people. We recognize ourselves as a sea people, and we find it better to sail across the Atlantic and back on an annual basis than it would be to just live on the land in New England. And part of the problem with living on the land in New England is having enough food for the year round, because they could actually, through the seal, the whale and such that they could get on their trip, have enough food to store up so they could actually live during the winter on the New England coast without taking away food that would be used by those people that were actually living there year round. Remember, if any of you have been to Maine in the wintertime, the snows can get 30 feet deep. It's not a real pleasant area unless you're familiar with living in the snow and feel comfortable with it. And these are people that come from a stock that were even further north than Maine and Newfoundland. That means we now have a maritime people crossing the ocean on an annual basis. They would be bringing things with them and trading things. Now, one of the things, if you know what a narwhal is, it's a whale that the male has a tooth that sticks out from the front of its nose, and that tooth is curlicued. If any of you have ever heard a story of the unicorn, the tooth looks an awful lot like what the horn on the unicorn is described as. Now imagine these maritime people crossing the North Atlantic, and all of a sudden they see a pod of narwhals. Let's say they've got 5 or 6 or 7 of these kayaks, 1 and 2 person kayaks, and so narwhals, like most whales, are friendly actually. They're not trying to poke their nose through the boat or their tooth. I imagine it wouldn't feel all that good to poke it through the boat anyway, get hung up in there. But in any case, if they saw a kayak, they would come up to the surface to get a better view, as many of the whales do along the eastern and western coast of our land, and actually be available. Now, taking all these boats, the kayaks out, one of the key things that would be fun to do would be have a child on the front of your kayak or in the front space of your kayak, and be able to get that kayak right over a narwhal with the tooth, and when the whale came up, ride the narwhal on the ocean. Then you get over to Norway, and over time they would learn how to speak the language and communicate with these people, and they would tell the story of the narwhal and riding it. Well, these are landlubbers that wouldn't know what a narwhal was and wouldn't know how to describe riding a whale. As a matter of fact, they wouldn't even be able to conceptualize riding on top of a whale. And they would try and tell the story, but they would have to use something that they could recognize as something you could ride. And all of a sudden you have a horse with a horn on it, which would be the unicorn. So this may well be the basis of the unicorn fairy tale. Once they got over there, they would want something to trade with, and certainly the narwhal tusks, when they had them, walrus tusks that they could carve while they were on the iceberg, would be another trading good. But they had another trading good that was very, very available where they came from, and that is copper. From the Great Lakes all the way up to St. Lawrence to the Atlantic Ocean, a large amount of copper was traded 7,000 years ago, because on Lake Superior they have mines where tons of copper were in fact taken out of the ground. They had what's called natural, I think it's natural or native copper, that came up as tongues of copper, solid copper, that all you had to do, and they were at an angle, is build a fire under it and it would melt the copper. If you would make little trenches into the ground under it, the copper would go in there and you'd actually create ingots of copper, which could then be carried and traded all along that St. Lawrence waterway. This copper would have ultimately made it to the maritime archaics and red paint people, and they would have traded that with people in Norway. Now, the interesting thing about that is that would have been somewhere around 4,000 years ago. And that was, in fact, the beginning of the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean. And in the Mediterranean, they were actually farming, or they were actually making copper by crushing it out of a rock and then smelting it down to create the copper. It takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of wood, it takes a lot of effort, versus this copper that came from the New World that literally could be brought over with no trouble if you could get back to the point, back to the New World. The trading people I talked about in the last program were in fact all along the North Atlantic, and in those days the original name of England was the Tin Isles, because there was tin on the Tin Isles. Tin is the second ingredient of bronze, copper being the first. The land to the west of England was referred to as the Brass Isle, or Brazil, and later on they named Brazil in South America, but the original name of Brazil was an island west of Ireland. So there you get the tie-in between the copper from the Lake Superior area and the tin from England being made into bronze by the trading people to trade with the people in the Mediterranean. So this is the story of the red paint people, maritime archaics, and how they met up with the trading people of the Mediterranean. Now, where do you get the red paint now? Gone through all this and you're wondering where the red paint was. If these people were crossing, these were people that had the same dark skin color of the Inuits and the Eskimos in the northern portions of Canada. They would have been having sex with the people they were visiting on the northeastern Atlantic, who were the light-skinned white people. So some of their children would have been, in fact, very white. Now you take those people and you put them out on the ocean for a period of 4 to 6 months, and they're exposed to the sun all the time, they are in fact going to burn unless you come up with some kind of sunscreen. If you take iron oxide and you mix it with whale oil or seal oil or walrus oil, and then you put that on the skin, you will have a sunscreen. But you'll have a sunscreen that does something very unique. It turns you bright red, and you stay bright red. Now that's interesting because in my research, and I wish I could find it again, I found a painting from the inside of one of the pyramids. In that pyramid, they had a boat. It actually looked a lot like a Numiak, come to think of it. It looked a lot like this. And in the boat, they had different figures standing up. The one in the very back was a yellow, and painted bright yellow, much as the people saw the Asians. Another one was in fact an olive color skin, as they found in the Arabic and in the Mediterranean areas. A totally black person, which was the Nubian people in the south of the Sahara Desert, the South Africa black Nubian. And then they had the white light-skinned people in front of that. And then in the very front of the boat, they had a person who was painted bright red. And we've never had a bright red person that we knew about. But that might explain the fact that the people that were in Egypt trading with these trading people heard stories of these bright red people that were in fact on the west of the white people, because the color actually made the movement of which places the various people came from. Rather an interesting painting. Like I said, I wish I would have had the ability to maintain memory of where I got it. So this is the story of the red paint people, and the fact that those people of the western portion of the Atlantic discovered the northeastern portion first, some 5 to 7,000 years ago. Thank you.